There we go.
To continue with the introduction of our guest speaker today, Bobbi Bowman. Bobbi is now a graduate student studying history at George Mason University. She knows the context and origins of much of Virginia's ugliest history. She has combined her journalism skills with her graduate school knowledge to unearth the story of how her Black family survived Virginia from 1806 to the present. It is with great pleasure we now welcome Bobbi Bowman. Let's give her a round of applause, jazz hand.
Well, thank you, Deidre, for a really wonderful introduction. Thank you, Linda, for inviting me. And thank all of you all for coming at 11 o'clock on a Saturday morning. It's so nice to see all of you all and so nice to see so many friends. I have to tell you, it is really thrilling to be able to chat this morning with other AAHGS members. I attended my first AAHGS convention in 2015 in Richmond, and the knowledge that I gained there really gave me the roadmap that I needed to find my family. So I will forever be grateful to AAHGS. In the next 25 minutes, I'm going to tell you the story of how my family overcame slavery in Central Virginia. And it's a story about how the ancestors fought slavery relentlessly. It's also an incredibly complicated story about the relationships between white people and Black people during slavery. And it's about how my family made a way out of no way several times. And this probably sounds like many of your stories. And at this point, I'm going to start sharing my screen because there are some slides I'm going to want to show you.
Okay.
Our story opens on a Wednesday morning in May of 1854 as Campbell County Deputy Sheriff John Conley approached William Williams' cabin to arrest him. Conley pushed in Williams' front door, quickly looked around the windowless one-room cabin, and realized William was not there. So Conley pulled out a piece of paper, nailed it to the front door, and he left. William Williamson returned home about sundown. He had spent the day working alone on his 100-acre farm. And at some point, he found this paper hanging on his front door, but he couldn't read it. And he couldn't read it because he was a former slave, and it was illegal for him to know how to read and write. The next morning, William took the paper, walked across the fields to Thomas Ross's house. Now, Rossa was a white slave owner. He owned 10 to 15 enslaved men and women and children. But William Rossa and William Williamson and Tom Rossa were unlikely longtime friends. Somehow these two men, one white and one Black, had grown to respect and trust each other, even while living in a slave society. Rossa quickly explained that the paper ordered William's immediate arrest. William knew that Virginia was finally forcing him to make a brutal choice, a choice between his freedom and his enslaved family. To keep his hard-won freedom that he had paid for, he would have to leave everything he knew and he loved, his enslaved wife, Mariah, their 7 children, because William's family did not belong to him. And that is the arrest warrant. If William stayed on his land near Mariah and the children, he would be arrested and sold from the terror of the slave auction block. William had worked 12 long years to avoid this terrible choice between his family and his freedom, and he had done it with the consent of his white slave-owning neighbors. A week after the arrival of the arrest warrant, William and Thomas committed an act of total defiance. They filed a deed in the Campbell County Courthouse in Rustburg, Virginia. And in it, Williams sold everything he owned to Thomas Rosser. He sold his land, his cabin, his farm animals, his tools, even the crops he was planting at that time. And the price was $5. And William never reported to the sheriff's office. Now, who was this William Williamson who defied the sheriff? William and the law that shadowed his life were about the same age. William thought he had been born about 1805 or 1806. 1806 was the same year Virginia slave masters in the state legislature in Richmond passed a so-called expulsion law. This law was to rid Virginia of most free Black people. It required most free Black people to leave the state a year after their freedom. If they stayed, they faced a return to slavery. As a small boy, probably as young as 8 years old, William was the property of Deborah Rex and Martha Williamson. Deborah Rex was a small farmer who had actually fought in the Revolutionary War. And Deborah Rex and his wife owned about 400 acres of land, a house, and 2 slaves, William and an older slave named Daniel. William probably never knew his parents. As a teenager, William managed to convince his master to let him buy his freedom. And in the 1820s, young, strong Black men and women standing in 5 to 10 pounds of iron chains atop the slave auction block in Rustburg sold for $800. That is $24,000 today. So how does a young man enslaved in the depths of a rural county in frontier Virginia earn $800? Well, some masters would sometimes pay their slaves in cash for overwork. Now, slaves already worked 6 days a week from sunrise to sunset, so you can imagine what overwork was. Deborah Rex also rented William to his neighbors to work on their farms, and those neighbors would pay Deborah Rex for William's work. And Deborah Rex may have been a, quote, good slave owner, and he might have shared part of those wages with William. However William did it, Deborah Rex wrote in his will in 1834 that William had paid for his freedom, but Deborah Rex did not give William his freedom. William would only be free after Martha died. So Deborah Rex died in 1838, and he left William his only horse. Martha died 4 years later in 1842, and she kept her husband's promise to free William, a promise, as we know, that was often broken by slave owners. And William was finally free. Now, the tax assessors valued Deborah Rex's and Martha's estate at $1,200. That's $36,000 today. The assessors valued William alone at $800. So my great-great-grandfather, at age 32, represented 75% of his master's wealth, and that was the bedrock of slavery. White people's wealth was not in their land or in their houses or even in their tobacco. Their wealth was in our ancestors, who they owned for generations. So William left the Williamson farm, and he and his horse waded across Button Creek onto his own land. He now owned 100 acres of land. Joel Rosser, a white slave owner and brother of Thomas, had sold William this land a couple of months earlier. And standing on land and selling land, as you could imagine, to a free Black man was an incredibly rare occurrence. Life was precarious enough for a free Black man. Life for a free Black man with land was downright dangerous. But standing on his land meant William was one of a handful of Black landowners in the county. Owning land also meant he worked alone. He had no help to build his cabin, to plant his crops. He had only his tools, his horse, and his dreams. And for the first time, he could eat well. Slaves raised the food for the white folks, but most slaves complained they never had enough to eat. And William could also help feed his family if their master, Joel Franklin, allowed it. So as William settled into his farm, Allen J. Wiley, the county tax collector, came to William's farm in the spring of 1843. Now, county tax collectors, like Wiley, had taken an oath to enforce the 1806 expulsion law. Tax collectors got a reward, in fact, for turning in free Black people who stayed more than a year after their freedom. But A.J. Wiley simply gave William a tax bill. He never gave him a summons. 7 years later, in 1850, 3 days after New Year's, William wrapped himself in his warmest ragged clothes, and he walked 2 miles from his farm to this courthouse in Rustburg. And here he registered as a free Black man. Yes, free Black people had to register if they were free. The court clerk recorded William's age as 45, height 5 foot and 11.5 inches tall, color mulatto, and this is the only description we have of our great-great-grandfather. Now, registering as a free man was really a first step in William's plan, really a plan that was forged in desperation, because the expulsion law allowed only one escape route. Only the Virginia state legislature could allow freed men and women to stay in Virginia legally. Now, William needed 4 things to make his appeal in Richmond. First of all, he needed a white attorney. He needed a white attorney to do all the legal work, which he could not read. So he hired a young attorney by the name of William Merrill, one of the few white attorneys who would actually represent Black people. Then Merrill wrote William's petition to the state legislature that talked about William's superior character, his hard work ethic, and his desire to stay near his enslaved family. Merrill also wrote a second petition signed by nearly 50 of William's white slave-owning neighbors. And you'll see some of these signatures on the slide. And that petition read in part, "We are Billy Williamson's neighbors and have known him for many years. We believe him to be a man of honesty, not addicted to drunkenness, gaming, or any other vice. All of his neighbors are willing and indeed desirous that the legislature pass a law permitting him to remain in this state, as he is known as an honest and prosperous man." And the signers of this petition included Thomas Rosser, Joel Rosser, and even Joel Franklin, who owned William's wife and children. Now, lastly, Merrill convinced John Speed, the newly elected state delegate from Campbell County, to introduce William's petition in the January 1851 session of the state legislature. Thus, William became the only free Black man in Campbell County to ever ask the Virginia General Assembly for a reprieve from the 1806 expulsion law. In Richmond, it took the state legislators only a month to deny William's request. And in the following spring of 1852, tax collector Wiley made his annual visit to William's farm. But that year, he arrived with a second man. And the second man was Robert Doss, who was the incoming tax collector. Now, Wiley was retiring. The following spring in 1853, Doss returned to Williams' farm alone, and that visit set in motion a savage struggle that would begin between a Black man fighting to keep his freedom and a white man determined to take it away. A.J. Wiley had visited Williams' farm for 9 years. He never cared about Williams' illegal status, nor the money it could earn him. But Robert Doss cared a lot about that money. So in the fall of 1853, Doss demanded that the county attorney arrest William for violating the 1806 law. A grand jury indicted William and issued the arrest warrant that William found nailed to his front door the following spring. That fall in 1854, the sheriff returned to William's cabin. He left another arrest warrant. William ignored that one too. Now, meanwhile, over in a neighboring county, Lunenburg County, the Doswell brothers were facing the same grim peril as William. They, like William, had been freed in 1842. They too had remained illegally so they could stay with their enslaved families, or near them, not with them, but near them. Their white lawyers also took their case to the Virginia General Assembly. And those allies fought in the General Assembly for 2 years, from 1852 to 1854, for allowing the brothers to voluntarily return to slavery, if they could sell themselves to a master that they chose. They wanted the right to entrust their lives to a white person whom they could trust to keep them near their families. Finally, in March of 1854, the Virginia legislators passed a voluntary slave law, but it only applied to the Doswell brothers. So after that voluntary slave law was passed, the white allies of other free Black men and women who rushed to Richmond to request similar voluntary slave laws for their clients. And of course, the state legislature has to talk about this and talk about this. Back in Campbell County, in October of 1855, the sheriff returned to William's house for a third time. And this time, he found him at home. But he didn't take him to jail because he knew he wasn't going anyplace. Back at the state legislature the following year, the state legislators finally decided they didn't care how free Black people returned to slavery, as long as they belonged to white masters. So they passed a voluntary slave law that applied to anybody. That same year, in 1856, Robert Doss, the tax collector, got himself elected Campbell County Sheriff. And as Campbell County Sheriff, he now commanded the full power to ravage and destroy William's existence. In April of 1857, the Campbell County Court ordered William to appear for his trial. Now William finally had to choose between his freedom and his family. And he sacrificed his freedom to stay close to his family using this new voluntary slave law. The final showdown between Williamson and Doss came in May of 1859. William Williamson, a free man for 17 years, walked into the only courtroom of the Campbell County Courthouse with Thomas Rosser. A few hours later, William left the courtroom, the property of his new master, Thomas Rosser. Rosser paid $500 to buy his longtime friend. That's nearly $16,000 today. And Doss received a percentage of that sale price. But our story continues. The Civil War started about 2 years later. Thomas Rosser's 3 sons All three of them, George, Walter, and John, joined the 11th Virginia Infantry, which was part of the Confederate Army. John, the youngest, died in camp. George was taken prisoner, and Walter Rosser was seriously wounded twice. In 1865, in fact, Walter was with General Lee when Lee surrendered at Appomattox. Appomattox is about 25 miles from Rustburg, and I think Walter Rosser probably just walked back to his family's farm along with his surviving friends from Rustburg. That surrender freed William, his family, and nearly 500,000 men, women, and children enslaved in Virginia for more than 200 years of generational bondage. So William's family left Joel Franklin's grasp with nothing but the clothes on their back. Finally, all 11 members could gather in the one-room cabin that their father had built so many years ago, and William and Mariah could finally live with their children, and they could live as a family. Now, Mariah and the children are listed in the 1870 census, but there is no William. So we have no record of his birth nor his death. The following year of June of 1871, Thomas Rosser filed another deed. And in that deed, he sold everything that William Williamson had sold to him. Thomas Rosser then sold to Mariah and her children for 5 years. And that was the same amount that he had paid 17 years earlier. Now, Mariah died in 1903, nearly 40 years at the end of the Civil War. And she left an estate of $110, which is an astonishing amount of money for a woman who spent half her life enslaved and then worked on basically a subsistence farm. And she named Walter Rosser as the executor of her estate. Yes, this is the same Walter Rosser who had been wounded twice in the Civil War, fighting to keep her and her family enslaved. But Mariah had known Walter Rosser since he was a baby. He was not a Confederate soldier to her. He was the son of the man who had saved her family. Now, as you can imagine, once I found this story and really pieced it together, I knew I had to find the descendants of Thomas and Martha Rosser to see if they knew this story, because this story was totally unknown to our family. Well, I did find them. And they didn't know anything about this story either. And they were just as pleased and just as proud as we are. And we had a family reunion with them in Lynchburg in 2019, and we remain in touch with them. And I thank you so much. And I'm happy to take your questions. I look forward to them. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen at this point. As soon as I find a cursor here. But why don't we go ahead? Linda?
Yes, I am here. And then let's see, Lisa has a question. And
yes, please. Linda, if you can maybe stop sharing to get this off. Because I can't.
let me see if I can do that. Just a minute. And we'll build the questions.
So while Linda is working on while Linda's working on the video, maybe I can ask a question that you can think. Yeah. So one, thank you so much. This was really fascinating. I really love the way, and let me turn on my video. Yeah, I really love the way you presented it. It just was so
like a story.
Yeah, it was so alive. So really, thank you for that. And one of the things that struck me just as you were telling the story was some of the details that you had woven sort of into it, even like with the at the beginning when you talk about the note or the letter being on the door and things of that nature. Can you just kind of maybe briefly? I'm just fascinated how good this research is. maybe a very quick overview of how you got all this detailed information together. I'd really be interested, because court records and are challenging to get through and turn them into a story as opposed to just facts. So just thank you.
Just about everything comes from the records. So when I found the arrest warrant, it says it was nailed on the door of his cabin. I know where Thomas Rossa lived. I know where William Williamson lived. I know that he had to have somebody who could read this to him. So my assumption is this is one of the few assumptions. I mean, I'm a journalist, right? So I gave myself very little liberty to make assumptions, because we don't do that. But I assumed for this story, given the relationship between Thomas Rossa and William Williamson, that is the only person he would have gone to read this note that he obviously couldn't read. When I say he dressed in ragged clothes, well, that's all our folks had. So he wore raggedy clothes, and he had to go in the back door of the courtroom. The other thing that has helped me, I've done a lot of reading about Virginia history. I've read all the slave chronicles from Virginia. And I've woven all of that together.
Some tea.
What?
Give me some tea.
Okay, instead of the apple juice?
Yeah.
Everybody, please mute yourselves. Or Lisa, help me mute everybody, please.
Lisa, does that
Eric?
answer your question?
Absolutely. It's just kudos to you, and I wish I could be as good of a writer as you are. So thank you for
But
that.
I tell you the other thing, I'll just say this very briefly. I thought I could write a story because I'm a journalist. I was wrong. I couldn't write this kind of story. I actually took 2 writing classes at George Mason University, which were just enormously helpful to me. Because writing a story like this is not like writing a news story.
But the research is important, that journalistic research skill.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Other questions?
To continue,
Comment?
before we continue, there are some people who are not muted. I see Herbert Shannon, I believe Richard Prince. If you would mute your mic, that would help for clarity in answering the questions. All right, the next person I see is Diane Fuentes. Go ahead, ma'am.
I wanted to ask Bobbi, that was enthralling, like everybody says. It was very well written, and you lead it just like a great story. But what was and we all know about research, and like you mentioned that a lot of these are court and census records, and I think people don't realize the really good stuff you can get out of that. I've done some geological research for my family too, down in Mexico, and there's a lot of great stuff out of the Mormon people, right, who do records too. But what did you find the hardest thing to find out when you were trying to get the information? Was there a nugget of information that you had trouble getting, or what was the most challenging part of this research?
I have to take, this is like Diane and I are both recovering journalists at this point. This is just like covering a story. You have your main sources, which you start with the census and the wills and the deeds, and then you go to the deed of trust. I mean, you just look everywhere you can think of in a courthouse. I've looked at court records, I've looked at court minutes, I've looked at minute books, but you just turn over every rock, because this is like panning for gold, frankly. And it's as we all know, because we've all done this, this is all hard work. And you find a nugget here and a nugget there. The thing that I found most helpful was when I first started to do a timeline, because I had not realized until I looked at my timeline that the time of the arrest warrant and the time that he sold the property to Thomas Rossa was 1 week. So once I had assembled the timeline, the story sort of wrote itself from the timeline. Does that answer your question?
Yep, that's good advice. Yeah, I was wondering, I guess really all of it takes time to
All of it takes
unravel.
time.
Yeah.
We've been doing this. I found this story in 2010.
Okay. Thank
Other
you.
questions? Thank you.
I don't see any more.
I have a question.
Carol?
Bobbi, it's a great story. I wanted to find out, did you go to the areas where this cabin was? Were you able to get onto that land and take any pictures, or what's on the land now? And is it in any of the descendants? Do they possess any of that land now?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for asking that. I hired a surveyor, frankly, to find the land. I'm pretty good at going through land records, but I knew, so I hired a surveyor in Campbell County, and I said, this is where this land is, here's the deeds for it. Can you show me? And once she found it for me, I went there. I'm a journalist, right? I found the name of my great-grandfather, one of William and Mariah's children, and inherited the land because all of the brothers and sisters moved away. And so that's my grandpa Philip. And Grandpa Philip had to sell the land in 1909. I think, as we all know, 1909, the early 1900s were a terrible time for Black people. It's when all the Jim Crow laws were passed. It's when they basically tried to stop us from voting. The NAACP was formed in 1909, because of all the terrible things that were happening to Black people. That's all you need to know about 1909. So here is my great-grandfather living in Central Virginia with 100 acres of land in the midst of all of it. This is why we have to understand the history to understand sort of really what our ancestors were facing. So I think, given all of that and everything that was going on in Virginia, I think white people threatened him. Anyway, he sold the land in 1909. And therefore, my grandparents were sharecroppers. So, so I found the land. I found the new owner of the land. I wrote him a letter. I said, we used to own this land, and I'd like to come by and stand on it. And he was very nice. Like, who is this woman who's writing me? I never heard back from him, so of course I went there. I'm a journalist. That's what I do. And my cousin went with me, and we pulled up to this nice farmhouse. His name is Mr. Riley. I said, Mr. Riley, did you get my letter? And he said, I did. I said, would you mind, if we just stood here and took some pictures? And that's what we did. I'm sorry, I'm going to cry about this. I know now that my great-great-grandparents are buried on that land, but just to stand on that land, this was 2019, frankly, when I did this. More than 100 years after Grandpa Philip had to sell it, it was really a moving experience, frankly. So yes, we know exactly where it is. And when we had the reunion with the Rosses, we took them there. And because they used to stay, they are the great-grandchildren of Thomas and Martha Rossa. And they knew that their farm also has been sold, but they remembered the area.
I think Lisa Neal.
Yeah, just a follow-up question. So, can you remind the name of the white attorney who was representing Black people? That was
William Merrill. It's Murrell.
Okay. Did you happen to do any other or come across any other cases that he was involved in that also represented Black people in the area or around?
I did not, but I can tell you that there is a book, a historian who works in Williamsburg has written a book about the number of Black people who filed these petitions to voluntarily return to slavery. I can't remember the name of the book. I'll send it to Linda. It's written like a law brief. I mean, it is absolutely unbelievable that this historian went and found all of these incredible stories about Black people wanting to, and he writes it like a legal brief. I mean, it is bloodless. I mean, these are our ancestors we're talking about. But anyway, as a source, it is helpful. You're sitting there crying and wondering how a man could write such a boring book about, about people selling themselves back into slavery so they can stay with their families.
Powerful,
Linda?
very powerful. Thank you.
I think, Linda. is next.
Yes, thanks again. Such a wonderful presentation of
you.
information that even we genealogists don't know. I was especially impressed to hear about that 1806 expulsion law and then the 1856 law that allows free Blacks to enslave themselves with the master of their choosing. So some of us have heard bits and pieces of that, but at least I didn't know those exact laws or the dates. But my question is, you came upon this document about your ancestor in the Campbell County Courthouse. What inspired you to go to the courthouse in the first place? And the second piece is, my family, as you know, is also has roots in the Campbell County area. Some of them left, moved to Pennsylvania, Washington, Boston. Some stayed. Do you know what made your ancestors stay in the Campbell County area?
So let me answer both points. Let me talk about these expulsion laws for a minute. Practically every southern state had one of these expulsion laws because you cannot run a slave society with free Black people running around, right? Because then enslaved Black people get the idea that maybe they can also be free. So every state had a law like this to basically either force free Black people to leave or to go back into slavery. You're basically asking why I was in the courthouse. I was in the courthouse because my sister and I still own land in Campbell County. This is land that my father bought. My father is a Bowman. The Williamsons are my mother's family. So, and there was an issue that had come up about this land. I'm a reporter. I said, let me go down and read the original deed. You know, I love courthouses. I know my way around courthouses. So I drove down from Washington, you know, I'm standing there in the courthouse, quickly found the deed. Nothing in the deed was going to help us, you know, with this small problem we were having. But as a reporter, Dick and I both learned at the Washington Post, when you're in a courthouse, you go fishing because courthouses are secret keepers and you never know what you're going to find in a courthouse. So I said, let me see if I can find any Williamsons. My mother, you know, I'd always ask my mother about names of the ancestors. I wanted their names. Frankly, I didn't want to know anything more than that. I knew just enough to know I didn't want to know what they had been through. So I had all these names. So I thought, okay, I'll just go through deep book, see if I can find any Williamsons. Almost the first name I found was Mariah Williamson. And I'm standing there thinking, what in the world is my great-great-grandmother doing in a deed book? We'd never owned any land. We walked out of slavery into sharecropping. And what I had found was the 1871 deed. And I knew enough to know that this deed was basically telling me that a white man, that I had a great-great-grandfather who owned 100 acres of land before the Civil War. He had sold it to a white man, and the white man was then selling it back to our family. We know that does not happen, right? White people steal our land, they never give it back. But that's what this deed said. And then I stepped back for a minute and I realized that the ancestors had come for me, frankly. That the ancestors were sort of tired of me thinking they were nothing but victims. And they were now going to take me by the hand and show me exactly how they had fought slavery and how they had made it through. So I found this because the ancestors came for me.
You.
Did I answer all your questions, Linda?
Yes, looking forward to the book. Such a wonderful story and such an important story.
Thank you.
We have another question. I see you, Marvin, but someone put a question in the chat. Robin Vergis, do you want to ask the question? If not, the question is, did you ever hit any brick walls? By the way, Robin Vergis' grandmother's father was a Williamson from Covington, Georgia.
Okay, all right. There are other Williamson families out there. Oh, I always hit brick walls. I have to tell you what I do when I hit a brick wall now. I simply say to the ancestors, I know you want me to find you. You have to show me where this information is. And they always have. They always lead me to what I need.
I don't see anything else in the chat. Anyone else?
Well, Marvin had a question.
Oh, yes, thank you. Marvin?
I want to congratulate you on on this accomplishment, but also on focusing on the victories within your family. And it would be wonderful to see more people focus on that and helping us move forward. And I hope you get enough positive responses from people when you talk about the victories that you speak of. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I mean, one of the many things the ancestors have taught me in going through this. Let me just say, we are all descendants of warriors. All the ancestors were warriors. They fought slavery tooth and nail. And they had to do it in very quiet ways, right? They had to do it in very subtle ways. White people knew they were always fighting. And we know that because of the laws that they passed. You know, all of us are of an age when we went to school and frankly learned American mythology, that, you know, Black people were happy and, you know, slave masters were nice. But what we took from that is that our ancestors were victims and they didn't fight back. We know better now. And if you do nothing but read the laws that all these Southern states passed, they kept passing laws because they kept having to find ways to keep us quiet and keep us suppressed. So, I mean, as you read your family stories, just look for the small ways in which your ancestors just fought this system tooth and nail.
There's time for more questions, Linda? I don't see any more hands.
Yeah, it's 11:47. Any other questions? Such an interesting, yeah, Herbert, and you need to unmute yourself.
Yes, I want to ask you, did you ever find out where your great-grandparents were buried on the property?
No, I'm gonna have to go back. I'm gonna have to go back and do two things. I'm gonna have to go back and ask Mr. Riley if I can visit his property again. And then I'm gonna have to ask the ancestors, just stand there and say, William and Mariah, I know you're gonna have to show me where you are. But what they did was I've looked at enough old cemeteries in Campbell County to know there's usually some kind of slab in the ground, some kind of flat slab. I'm hoping I can do that. I mean, I'm not gonna hire radar detecting, you know, to look underground. But I truly think if I stand on the land in February, you know, when you can really see things, and if I ask Mariah and William where they are, they're gonna show me.
It appears there are no more questions in the chat. There are nice comments.
Oh, I should look at those. Well, if there are no other questions, I can't thank you all enough for spending part of your Saturday morning to listen to this family story. I encourage all of you, I'll go find the ancestors. You will be so happy and so surprised. Thank you.
Well, we thank you, Bobbi Bowman. That's where the thanks lie, for sharing great information. And it's not only about your family, but tidbits of information where we can use in our own personal journeys.
If there's anything I can do to help people look for things, I highly recommend the Library of Virginia. They are amazingly helpful. They have amazing records. And that's where I originally found William's court case. It is amazing the amount of information they have on Black people there. Thank you so much again.
But Bobbi, I have one other question. If we want to get in contact with you, do you have an email address, a telephone number?
Oh, sure. I'm happy to give you my email. It's Bobbi. It's Bobbi, last name Bowman, number 17 at gmail.com. And maybe somebody could drop that in the chat for me. Bobbi Bowman 17 at gmail.com. Thank you very much. Oh, thank you, Diana.